In your hand, it weighs almost nothing. Barely a gram of silver. A disc of metal no wider than your thumbnail. And yet, this tiny coin carries the weight of an entire nation's history. This is the 1921 Canadian 5-cent piece. Known among collectors, historians, and treasure hunters alike by a single, regal title. The Prince of Canadian Coinage. Of the over 2.5 million silver 5-cent coins struck by the Royal Canadian Mint in 1921, an estimated 400 to 480 are believed to have survived. The rest, millions of them, were fed into furnaces, melted down, erased from existence by order of the Canadian government. What you are looking at is one of history's most deliberate destructions of its own currency. And the story of why that happened is one of the most fascinating chapters in the long, rich saga of Canadian coinage. To understand this coin, we must first understand the world that made it. The year is 1921. The Great War has been over for 3 years. Canada has emerged from the carnage of the Western Front forever changed, no longer simply a colony of the British Empire, but a nation that had bled and sacrificed on the world stage, and demanded to be recognized accordingly. King George V sits on the British throne. His effigy, sculpted by artist Edgar Bertram McKennell, appears on the obverse of every Canadian coin in circulation. Crowned, dignified, and facing left, he gazes across the coin's surface as if surveying a dominion that, in 1921, stretches from the Atlantic shores of Nova Scotia to the Pacific coast of British Columbia. Canada is a vast nation, still growing, still defining itself. And its currency is a direct reflection of its identity, of its ties to the British Crown, of its forests and wilderness, of its proud relationship with the land. For over 6 decades, the Canadian 5-cent coin had been made of silver. A small, delicate piece, just 15.5 millimeters in diameter, weighing barely 1.2 grams, it carried the maple leaf wreath on its reverse, 22 meticulously engraved maple leaves arranged on 2 boughs, tied with a ribbon at the base, and surmounted by an imperial crown. It was a beautiful coin. Modest in denomination. Magnificent in design. And it was about to be abolished forever. Canada, by the early 20th century, had a secret weapon buried beneath its soil. Nickel. In the vast mining regions of northern Ontario, particularly around Sudbury, Canada had become the world's single largest producer of nickel. It was a metal of extraordinary industrial utility, hard, corrosion-resistant, and increasingly in demand as the world industrialized. Canada didn't just have nickel. Canada was nickel. And so, in May of 1921, the Government of Canada passed a sweeping piece of legislation, the Currency Act of 1921. The law authorized a fundamental transformation of the 5-cent coin. Out with the old, the small, elegant silver piece, delicate as a jewel, that Canadians had carried in their pockets since 1858. In with something new, a larger, heavier coin, 21 millimeters across, struck entirely from pure Canadian nickel. The reasoning was practical. Silver was expensive. Nickel was abundant. The United States had already been calling their 5-cent coin a nickel since the 1860s. Why shouldn't Canada's 5-cent piece actually be made of nickel? It was logical. It was economical. And for the silver 5-cent coin, it was a death sentence. By the time that legislation passed, the Royal Canadian Mint in Ottawa had already struck millions of silver 5-cent coins dated 1921. The full planned mintage was approximately 2,582,000 pieces. Every single one of them, suddenly, was obsolete. What happened next is one of the most dramatic events in the history of Canadian numismatics. The order came down, melt them. Mint workers loaded the silver 5-cent coins, 1921 dated pieces, along with massive quantities of surviving 1920 dated coins, into the furnaces. 3 million coins, many of them freshly struck, bearing the face of the king, bearing the maple leaf wreath that had defined Canadian coinage for 6 decades, reduced to raw silver. That silver would go on to serve other purposes. Some of it, historians believe, was ultimately used to strike larger denomination coins in subsequent years, as demand required. But the 5-cent silver piece? It vanished. Almost vanished. Because a handful of coins, a precious, tiny handful, were spared. Visitors to the Royal Canadian Mint in Ottawa could, in those years, purchase coins directly as souvenirs. And so a small number of 1,921 silver 5-cent pieces were sold directly across the mint's counter, escaping the furnaces entirely. A few others, tucked away in collector sets or simply overlooked, slipped quietly into private hands. When the smoke cleared, numismatic historians estimate that between 400 and 480 specimens of the 1921 silver 5-cent coin survived the Great Melt. Out of 2.5 million struck. That survival rate, less than 0.02%, transformed an ordinary circulation coin into one of the rarest and most sought-after pieces in all of Canadian numismatic history. Let us pause here, and simply look. Because whatever its historical significance, whatever its rarity or its monetary value, the 1921 silver 5-cent coin is, above all else, a work of art. The reverse, the side you see most prominently in collector photographs, was designed by William Henry James Blakemore. It is, by any measure, a masterpiece of miniature engraving. At the top, a crown. Detailed, regal, three-dimensional in its relief. Beneath it, 2 sweeping boughs of maple leaves, 22 individual leaves, each one rendered with its own veining, its own curl and shadow. The boughs arc gracefully inward, meeting at the bottom in a ribbon tied in a flowing bow. In the center of this wreath, the denomination. A bold numeral 5. Below it, the words cents and Canada, in clean, authoritative serif capitals. And beneath that, separated by a tiny dash, the date, 1921. Turn the coin over. On the obverse, the portrait of King George V, based on the design by Edgar Bertram McKennell. The king faces left, wearing the imperial state crown, rendered in extraordinary detail for a coin barely larger than your fingernail. Around the edge, the Latin inscription, Georgives V de Gra, Rex Etind MP, King George V, by the grace of God, King and Emperor of India. The entire coin is struck in 80% silver and 20% copper, the standard sterling adjacent alloy of Canadian silver coinage of the era. The edge is reeded. The fields, on well-preserved examples, shine with a luminous, almost liquid quality. This was the last generation of the silver 5-cent coin. And Blakemore's design, the wreath, the crown, the maple boughs, would not survive into the nickel era. When the new pure nickel 5-cent piece debuted in 1922, it carried an entirely different reverse, simpler, sturdier, more industrial. Functional where Blakemore's had been poetic. The 1921 silver 5-cent piece was, in every sense, the end of an era. For generations of Canadian coin collectors, the 1921 5-cent piece has occupied a singular position, the ultimate prize. The coin that completes the set, and the coin that most collectors never hold. Its rarity drives values that seem almost impossibly high for a coin that was, after all, worth only 5 cents when it was minted. In circulated grades, worn from whatever brief time in commerce these surviving coins may have seen, values begin in the thousands of dollars. A coin graded VG8, a coin showing clear but moderate wear, can command between $2,000 and $3,000. In finer grades, the numbers escalate sharply. Mint state examples, coins that escaped both the furnaces and the friction of circulation entirely, are in a category all their own. The finest known specimen, graded MS-67 by PCGS, the professional coin grading service, represents the absolute pinnacle of the series. In January of 2010, that coin sold at auction for $115,000 United States dollars. 2 years later, it changed hands again, this time for $160,000, sold by the Canadian Numismatic Company to a private collector. One coin. 5 cents face value. $160,000. That is what rarity, history, and beauty can do. The 1921 silver 5-cent coin did not exist in a vacuum. It was the final chapter of a story that began 63 years earlier. When Canada's Confederation was young, when the new Dominion needed its own coinage to distinguish itself from the currencies and tokens of the colonial era, the silver 5-cent piece was there. Small, trusted, and elegant. Generation after generation of Canadians carried it in their coat pockets and their purses. It changed hands at market stalls and railway ticket windows. It passed from child to shopkeeper to farmer, bearing the face of Victoria, then Edward VII, then George V. It witnessed the building of the Transcontinental Railway, the Klondike Gold Rush, the First World War, the Spanish flu, the birth of a modern nation. And then, in 1921, the government said, that era is over. Canada was changing. Its economy was modernizing. Its identity, still deeply British in its institutions, yet uniquely its own in character, was evolving. The nickel 5-cent piece that replaced the silver coin in 1922 was bigger, bolder, more utilitarian. It belonged to a younger, more industrial Canada. But the silver piece, delicate, refined, whispering of another age, remained behind, frozen in time. Today, the surviving examples of the 1921 Canadian silver 5-cent coin are held in private collections, museum vaults, and the portfolios of serious numismatists across North America and beyond. Each one is a survivor in the most literal sense. Each one escaped a government order that sent millions of its brothers and sisters to the furnace. When you hold one, when you feel the cool weight of that silver disc, when you run your fingertip over the maple leaf wreath that Blakemore engraved with such patient precision, you are holding a piece of Canadian history that very nearly ceased to exist. The Royal Canadian Mint, which has operated in Ottawa since 1908, continues to produce some of the finest coins in the world. But no coin it has ever made carries the particular poignancy of this one. Not the gold maple leaf. Not the commemorative silver dollars. Not the limited edition collector's sets that now sell for hundreds of dollars apiece. None of them carry what the 1921 5-cent piece carries, the knowledge that they were supposed to be destroyed. That their survival was an accident of history, a handful of visitors, a few collector sets, the simple chance that not every coin made it to the furnace in time. There are coins that mark great moments in history. Coins minted to celebrate victories, to honor monarchs, to mark the founding of nations. And then there are coins like this one, coins that matter precisely because they almost didn't make it. The 1921 Canadian silver 5-cent piece was never meant to survive. It was a casualty of progress, of economics, of a government making a practical decision about the future of its currency. The fact that 400 of them still exist in the world today, still gleaming, still carrying the face of a long-dead king and the maple leaves of a nation, is nothing short of miraculous. Numismatists call it the Prince of Canadian Coinage. And that title is fitting. Not the king, that crown belongs to the great 1911 silver dollar, or the legendary 1948 George VI dollar. But the prince, young, rare, glamorous, a little tragic. A coin that should have inherited a great future and instead was cut short, surviving only in these few, precious, scattered examples. The next time you handle a 5-cent coin, a modern Canadian nickel, perhaps, bearing the familiar beaver on its reverse, take a moment to consider what came before it. Consider that in 1921, on the benches of the Royal Canadian Mint in Ottawa, workers struck millions of tiny silver coins bearing the face of a king and a wreath of maple leaves. That most of those coins went into a furnace and are gone forever. That the silver they contained was melted down and repurposed, their identities erased. And that a few, just a few, survived. They are still with us. Still beautiful. Still 5 cents. Still Canadian.